I'm very glad to be here and to have this chance to share with you part of my research on neurodivergence. And a huge part of my research is about the gendered experiences in neurodiversity and especially in autism. So, what I would like to introduce you today, I have an overview here, is first of all, the need for an epistemological revolution, I would say, able to account for any kind of experiences, male, female, queer. And my lens, as the majority of you knows, is phenomenology. So I use a specific notion from phenomenology that is the notion of life, so the experiential body, the body intertwined with a psyche in order to shift from a vision of the subject as a brain and a vat to a subjectivity which is primarily a lived and living body. In the context of neurodiversity and autism, one of my main references is George Frankl, who was a Jewish psychiatrist, not very well known actually, because he did work with Kanner and Asperger, and he was Jewish again. So historically, he had no chances to become famous, so to say. And I will argue that camouflaging in particular can be conceived of as a compensatory bodily strategy and a bodily language. So another perspective that I take into account is the communication. How do we communicate? How do neurodivergent people communicate or not? And I will make use of a lot of first-person reports from autistic women and trans. And in the last part, I will briefly sketch which are the consequences of this biological approach to neurodivergence in the education field, but mainly in the development of a personal identity. And I will briefly suggest some future directions. So, first, very broadly, what is neurodivergence? Neurodivergence is still a blurred concept, is a term coined by Judith Singer in the 90s. But it's interesting because we cannot find a univocal definition of this term. So very generally, it concerns atypical neurological developments conceived of as normal human differences. And this mainly includes autism and other neurological conditions such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, bipolar disorder, developmental dyspraxia, and so on and so forth. Also Tourette syndrome, for instance. And the literature about this topic is divided mainly into two models. The first one is the medical model, and the second one, the social model. While the medical model mainly assumes that the cause of neurodiversity lies in the individual's brain or mind, and for this reason, intervention could operate at the individual level. For instance, they wanted to use stimulants for ADHD individuals. The social model states that neurodiversity is instead something that emerges entirely from society's responses to individuals' impairments. Let's notice also the language that they use. And they reject intervention aiming to change or teach skills to neurodiverse people. So I don't like none of them, basically, because in both cases, the vision of the subject at stake is individualistic and disembodied. So the subject is conceived of as a mind or a brain only, completely detached from the living body and the dynamic relationship with others and the world that it entails. So the focus of the dominant scientific approach is always on the neurodiverse minds and not on bodies. And this leads very often to the adoption of a perspective which is detached from the concrete space we inhabit through our bodies and is also conducive, to my view, to a vision of the subject in a brain in a vat, as I was telling. So my proposal is to adopt an ecological approach. That is to say that we need a change of paradigm because it's reductive and impossible to talk about neurodiverse minds or brains because we are all different bodily subjectivities in constant interaction with the others and the world. So to focus exclusively on the brain has also the effect of undervaluing the role of gender and, sexual orientation in the development, especially of the personal identity. And something that is important in my view is that in the scientific literature, conditions like autism or ADHD are still considered as male disorders. For instance, there are neuroimaging studies that suggest that the brain's feature of autism are qualitatively and quantitatively different between males and females. And according to these studies, while males seems to be characterized by specific risk mechanism, females are provided with protective mechanism, so they are more empathic. And there are many theories. Let's think about the famous one developed by Simon Byron Cohen, the extreme male brain theory, according to which autism is a male disease, a male condition. Since clinical samples have shown a sex-gender ratio between 4 to 1 or 5 to 1. More specifically, also concerning the so-called high functioning or Asperger syndrome, it seems that it occurs in 9 males for every 1 female. Now, how should we interpret this data? In my view, there are some things that we need to stress out. The first one is that, especially in neuropsychiatry, the notions sex and gender are often confused and used together. So there are no differences between these two important concepts. Of course, this is questionable. A qualitative analysis, in my view, can be helpful in order to shed light on the real meaning of these two dimensions and the different nuances that are present in between these two dimensions. Secondly, we need to take into account that in the scientific papers and also tests about autism, females are often underrepresented. And this is caused by the fact that autism in girls are often confused with anorexia and other eating disorders. While these components can be instead the way of stopping social pain. So there are social and cultural biases that influence the diagnosis itself. In my view, we must give voice to every kind of subjective experience, emphasizing the lived experiential body over the biological genetic one. And this is even more important if we consider the increasing knowledge of queer experiences. Not only do we need to take into account neurodivergent women, but we also need to give voice and space to those who do not recognize themselves in the binary identity. So again, I feel the need for a shift from the biological to the experiential body. And in this regard, and also in order to include the phenomenon of camouflaging into a broader reflection on embodiment and sociality, I found, as I told you at the beginning, George Frank's paradigm very useful. So while Asperger did focus on autism as a behavioral condition, and Kanner, on the other hand, claims that it was a neurobiological condition, Frankl was interested in autistic language. So his leading question was how does the autistic child, because he dealt with children, communicate or not communicate with the people around her. And according to him, the state of autism has its complement in the state of being in communication with people. So one is either in the one condition or in the other. And starting from the assumption, very interesting, that talking is different from communicating, he distinguishes between what he calls affective language and word language. Affective language concerns basically non-verbal and communicative symbolization, so bodily language, facial expressions, sounds, and comprises true communicative symbols. It's a little bit Lacanian here, which have validity in the subject's family, in her country, and to some extent, he says, even all over the world, beyond the boundaries of the specific language of words that the baby is soon to learn. Word language, on the other hand, involves all verbal communicative symbolization. But I say that everyday language is a sort of fusion and integration of word language and affective language. So, according to Frankl, autistic people have a different affective language. And they also experience some problems with the non-verbal bodily expressions. And these can hinder the arising of what he calls a good contact with other persons. But what I found interesting in Frank's manuscript is the fact that he hypothesizes that a pseudo-affective language can be developed as a compensatory strategy to cope with the human necessity of being in contact with others. And these compensatory strategies are usually used by, of course, the so-called high-functioning autistic children, in his view, because they are provided with sufficient cognitive abilities and also linguistic abilities very, very often. And he gave us four examples of this alternative affective language. The first one is the monotonous rote verbal production, that is to say, vocal repetitions. We can claim today that is the phenomenon of echolalia. Then we have the automaton-like language, because he observed that some children do not only talk like an automaton, but their whole body looks like a mere mechanic support, because it was completely missing those gestures and corporeal attitude that are typical of our motor behavior. Again, the body is very important. Then we have the scanning language, that is a rhythmical language, yet lifeless and without emotional tone inflections, and the declamatory language, where feelings and emotions are reproduced in a very artificial way, using an over-dramatized and exaggerated inflection of the voice. This is similar to a performance in theater, for example. So, in my view, we can argue that camouflaging itself represents an alternative way to communicate, both through bodily expressions and through general behavior. So, we can add the fifth kind of language to the list, that is camouflaging itself, which is particularly used by girls. So, what is camouflaging? Is the way through which some autistic people find a way to navigate the neurotypical social world, to the point that sometimes they can appear as non-autistic or less autistic. And this phenomenon has been known in many ways, and as camouflaging, masking, or compensation. So we can claim at this point that autistic girls and autistic boys can have, for instance, a different style of communication if we follow this line of thought. So we are still in the domain of communication. This is why Frank's, in my view, is very important. What we can ask at this point is the question, should we really circumscribe a female phenotype of autism? I don't think it's necessary, especially if we start from the scientific context that it is at stake at the moment. But if we have to describe a female phenotype of autism, camouflaging is indeed a key feature of this kind of expression. I have collected here some some first-person reports. Women socialize by mimicking, and guys socialize just being themselves, for instance. And again, I think that with males, they never have this. It's like what I get down about his feeling when I have to interact. They are more happy to say like, no, I want to do my own thing. So it seems that autistic boys feel less social pressure to conform to the neurotypical environment. We will see in this part of the talk that there are many first-person accounts. I was reading again the slide this morning, and I was noticing that a lot of reports can be applied also to women in general. So I think that in general, we live in a I don't want to say necessarily patriarchal, but in a world where we feel more pressure, especially in academia, more pressure to be performative to the environment. I don't think that boys have the same difficulties and the same social pressure and influences by social expectation than us. So I just noticed this morning while I was collecting again the reports, that it's interesting to see these similarities. So I have collected some first-person reports using different sources, a paper from Bargella Italy, Peiterman, which uses a lot of interviews. There is a fascinating blog called the Autism in Pink Project. And of course, especially during my postdoc, I did read a lot of autobiographical accounts. There are some famous books like Hot Girl Out, Asperger's, Pretending to be Normal, and a collection of experiences in the edited book by Cook and Garnett, Spectrum Women. So it seems that female with autism tend to present restricted interest to social stimuli in comparison to male, and for instance, they seem to prefer people, animals, or music instead of trains or traffic lights. So it also seems that autistic females are more likely than the males to experience certain psychiatric concerns, such as anxiety and depression. This is a data that we need to take into account. And many of the reports I collected concern women that claim that masking require an ability to analyze and also systematize interactions to learn how to act more neurotypically in a way. The main strategies that seem to be used are assimilation. So I am motivated to conceal my behavior, my spontaneous behavior, and to pretend to understand the social norms, even if I'm not. There is the so-called masking, with girls attempting to hide their autistic features. Compensation. Some girls describe more complex strategies, such as actively researching normative social interaction. It's interesting because masking and compensation are used sometimes as synonym with camouflaging, but in fact are mechanism within the camouflaging phenomenon. Then, of course, we have imitation. The main coping strategies are developed in order to find a time alone because they are usually overwhelmed by the social environment. So they need a routine, and there are also problems in terms of coping with normal everyday situations. There is a huge area, in my view, of the camouflaging phenomenon that concerns the bodily features. There is a sensory sensitivities. The sensory issues are just the most difficult thing in the world, and it's very distressing. There is a specific bodily feeling of vulnerability and dependence. When I have people around, I have to try and think more carefully because and this is one of the of the sentence that in my view can be applied also to non-autistic women. Sometimes you give out the wrong body signals and people pick it up wrongly. I think that any of us can recognize ourselves in this sentence. And we have the feeling of being different. So this is another point that has been crucial in my research because the very first autistic person I did interview while I was a PhD student is a guy. And in one of our talks, at a certain point, he told me, I am a spontaneous transgressive, which is a very nice expression. But he was very proud of himself when he told me. He was a teenager at that time, and he told me, my classmates try to, with effort, to be different, to be alternatives. I am a spontaneous transgressive. I found it very nice. What I do not find very nice is that usually the female reaction is completely different because there is a sort of shame related to the autistic condition. I feel very different to most of people. I am prey in the world of predators. I knew that I was different. I have always been different in so many ways that it was unbelievable. So there is a completely different reaction here. Then we also have other two components, meltdowns and shutdowns, which are basically ways to cope with this effort to camouflage. So shutdown is something more reserved and is sort of bottling up of emotions, while meltdowns can be louder and sometimes also aggressive. But both of these phenomena are responses to having to mask for too long. And of course, each autistic person too long can vary. So there is no way to understand when is too much. Eye contact is another issue as well. Here, the picture is a beautiful painting that an autistic women made, Patricia George Zwiger. And we also have a specific report concerning the eye contact. Eye contact was actually something that they were kind of trying to drill home, like when you give an interview. Because eye contact can be distracting and uncomfortable for me. So I have learned to look up here, in between someone's eyes, or, look at their mouth. So there are ways to cope with the uncomfortable feeling to look someone else in the eye. But there are also features which concern our behavior, basically. So, as I told you, someone actively make research on behavior and social norms. Because it's easier in a way to understand and to anticipate what to do in a social situation. And masking can become a routinized habit. So it's like here we can read it's like a background app, it's always running. So it's something that become very like yes, like a skill, so to say. So there is also basically the feeling of being uncomfortable with, for instance, personal interest because they are conceived of as immature. Here we have the example of this girl who loves My Little Pony, but hides this interest because she found it's not fitting with her age, so she still likes to play with them at home. So we have different ways of camouflaging in different contexts, and of course, there is less need to camouflage at home. One of them said, "At home, I can be myself." And there is also a desire for older and fantasy friendship. The majority, it's something typical of autistic girl to have an imaginary friend. Concerning instead autistic trans experiences, I'm very happy to see that Ruby Haig is here because I rely a lot on her paper. There are no papers about it and not a lot of first-person reports, so I collected here the main ones. And there is a very recent paper written by her, is dated 2025, and here she phenomenologically describes the trans experiences of camouflaging in different ways. It can be conceived as like a unified mask in a way, or different masking, different mask, one over the other. So we don't have to hide only the fact that you are autistic, but also you have to align with the gender that we truly identify with. On the other hand, the different layers of camouflaging can become a unique mask. So uh, all of these social expectations shape the camouflaging effect. And of course, this can influence a lot the sense of selfhood and can generate a need for authenticity and self-disclosure. Um, I quote here, "Living a masked existence has robbed me of me." So there is also a problem related to the personal identity. Also, in this case, or even more in this case, I would say I find the notion of lib very helpful because it can provide us with a novel perspective on corporeality, able to take into account the experiential body over the binary shaped one. In my view, there is also a problem with the notion of gender itself. What does it mean? In the American Psychological Association, there is a note where they notice that sex refers to an individual's biological status as male or female, whereas gender refers to, I quote, "the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for boys and men or girls and women." So this definition is a little bit overrated in my view. And always from the first person reports, I noticed that we can easily claim that another problem for autistic girls is a problem with the concept of gender in itself. Some of them told gender norms and stuff like that confuse me. And two other females commented, I don't feel relate to my own gender. I'm not good at being a girl. So trying to answer the question that I did state at the beginning, if we can actually describe a female phenotype, I found this paper by Pearson and Rose very enlightening. They claim the idea of a female autism phenotype fails to recognize large number of autistic people who are outside of the gender binary, potentially creating further barriers to diagnosis and support and the perpetuation of a stigmatizing narrative. And here I wanted to conclude my proposal, because if we look at phenomenology, we find the prominent importance of the notion of persons. So the way in which my body defines the unique individual that I am, and my experience of myself as this specific embodied person. So is there a proper personal dimension of the body? one that allows one personhood and personality to be badly lived and expressed, basically. Which are the consequences of the biological organic model that is actually adopted to approach divergence. Basically, the first problem is that there is a large number of undiagnosed girls who are going through the education system. So the problems that they can meet are, of course, a lack of identification, but also more practically, a lack of appropriate support, a lack of appropriately trained teachers and staff. And this results, of course, in social isolation, loneliness, depression. As we have seen, there is a high rate of depression, lowered grades, general confusion about, again, personal identities, and reduced future prognosis and opportunities. The long-term consequences concern isolation, achievements. So despite the girls' attempts to camouflage, the challenges are still a lot, and they can result in low self-esteem and isolation. So frequently, this leads to identity crisis because after years of piling on layers of camouflage, they are left wondering who they really are. So one woman notes, I don't know what it means to be me anymore, basically. So my suggestion for future research, or at least what I would like to integrate in my work, well, we can claim that there is a need for a new diagnostic approach in general because we cannot start from such a binary and biological paradigm. And this is not something that concerns necessarily autism, that luckily now has been included in the neurodivergence umbrella, but also for other conditions. Of course, we need more participatory research. I know that in the UK you are very well into participatory research, but it's not the case in the rest of Europe. So basically the problem, and I think that this is also why there are not so many papers on different, like, female and trans neurodivergence experiences, is that we start from this narrow control group of white male children, basically. And there is an avalanche effect. We need first-person reports. I think that qualitative interviews can be very helpful in order to properly and really listen to people's experiences. And another thing that is very important is the so-called autistic community connectedness. So there is we know now that there is an improved sense of well-being if the community of autistic people and neurodivergent people in general communicate with one another. And the involvement of the autistic community can, of course, minimize the ableism effect and also the inclusion of the biases that we have in our scientific theories. And I would conclude here, so we have time maybe for a discussion. And I wanted to thank you for your attention.